In this video, I'm going to talk about the single biggest problem in youth sports today that nobody seems to want to talk about. I'll be honest, I've gone back and forth now for weeks trying to decide if this is a video that I want to make, because I'll be honest, I'm going to get some pushback for what I'm about to talk about. Now, I'll probably get some hate mail, some strongly worded comments, and I might even lose out on some potential business relationships with organizations, but honestly, that's okay. I built my entire brand out here in Denver as being a mental performance provider that families can trust, and by also not shying away from the hard to talk about topics that pop up in my primary industry, the industry of youth sports. Now, what finally pushed me over the edge to make this video was I was on Facebook in one of the youth basketball centric groups that I'm in, and one of the basketball moms asked a very insightful question. She asked, why is it that every single year there are so many new basketball clubs that pop up in our area, and all of them seem to want to pressure our players to come play for them? And listen, this occurrence isn't just isolated to basketball. For example, about 4 years ago out here in my market in Denver, we had about 40 to 45 individual youth baseball clubs, which is a lot. Fast forward to today in 2021, that number is pushing close to 70. Now, is this happening because we need that many clubs? No, not really. Is this happening because there are so many great coaches and clubs out there that are putting out a great product and developing athletes with the athlete's best interest in mind? No, that's absolutely not the case. So why is this happening? Well, it's pretty simple. There's a lot of money in youth sport. In fact, in 2015, a year after I launched my mental performance company, youth sport was a $15 billion industry. That number grew to $19 billion by 2019, so it's safe to say that in 2021, youth sport has easily eclipsed $20 billion as an industry as a whole. And now this is the single biggest problem in youth sport, and I'll be honest, there isn't much that we can do about that number. But it's because there's so much money in youth sport due to the fact that the industry has become so privatized that this has led to a whole host of systemic issues that have plagued this industry and have really made life difficult for the families involved to navigate this system. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 4 of the biggest issues that I see that stem from the fact that there's so much money in this industry. And at the end of the video, I'm going to talk about what it's going to take to solve these problems. Now, this video is certainly going to be a little bit longer, so grab some coffee and let's get started. All right, to kick things off here, let's talk about everybody's favorite, and I'm sarcastic when I say this, issue number 1, daddy ball. To be clear, this conversation about daddy ball is not targeted towards parks and recreation programs or really any other nonprofit organization that just gets a group of kids together and asks a few of the parents to coach the team, i.e. control the chaos. If you're a parent that volunteers for that situation, you're a saint. What I'm talking about is a systemic problem that I've personally seen firsthand and that I've had several families complain to me about, in that there are oftentimes sport clubs that will charge families $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 to join the club, stock the teams with way more kids than they need, and then ask one of the parents to coach the team. Does anyone else intuitively see a problem with this? What is it that these families are paying all this money for? In fact, there's a club out here in Denver that's notorious for this, and they are one of the biggest clubs in their sport. Because what they'll do is they'll get all these teams that have way too many players on them, have one of the dads coach the team, and then tell the family that the value that they're getting is that they get to train and practice at their big fancy facility. Okay. But then it comes time to get maybe your 2 practices in a week, and the athletes show up and all of a sudden they realize that they're on the same field or court with 3 or 4 other teams, and there's not nearly enough instructors for all the kids that they have out there playing. Because listen, I've absolutely seen clubs out here jam 5 or 6 teams on the same field or court, have like 6 coaches for all those athletes, and each individual athlete gets about 6 reps before the time is up. and the club has to jam the next wave of kids through. Families across a variety of different sports end up paying thousands of dollars to these clubs. They still have to buy the jersey and their equipment, and you still haven't even factored in travel expenses. All for a team coached by a parent, or really any coach that the club could find, and maybe 2 practices a week where there's very little, if any, actual development happening. But to many of these clubs, it's simply a volume game. How many kids can they jam through their facility to help their bottom line? If that first issue hits a nerve for you and you're finally happy that somebody pointed it out, make sure to hit that thumbs up button for me right now. All right, so the second systemic issue that I see is clubs misrepresenting the value of actually being a part of the club. So obviously, due to the increasing number of sport clubs that pop up year over year that are available to these athletes, the space gets that much more competitive. So what we see is clubs that try and make their program more attractive to others and really stand out. So they may state that as a member of their club, athletes get strength and conditioning services, access to nutritional support, and maybe even some sports psychology or mental training services. Now, at face value, this sounds like a tremendous thing, and in many cases, it is. But let me share with you a story that happens far, far too much in this space. So I have a colleague that works in the strength and conditioning space out here in Denver, and she's incredibly good at what she does. I've seen the results that she's been able to get firsthand, and today, she's built up a really good reputation for herself. She was then approached by a basketball club in her area that said that they wanted her to be a part of their, so that way she could train their athletes, and it sounded awesome. So they marketed her as part of their club's programming, and they absolutely separated themselves from the other clubs in the area, and they were even able to charge the families that were coming into the club that year more. And it turns out they had the best turnout that they ever had. But then it came time for the season to start, and my colleague was all ready to go to start working with these athletes on a regular basis until she didn't. In fact, she only saw each athlete in the club 3 times that season, and she saw them in group sizes that she told the club were far too big for her to get meaningful results with the athletes. So the club charged the families more, paid her less than what she thought she was going to get. And my question to you is, where do you think all that extra money went that the club was able to make because they were able to convince the families to pay more because of this perception of all the additional value they thought they were going to get? And unfortunately, this happens way more than it should. It happened to her. It's happened to other people in her industry. And I'll even sorry to admit that early on in my career, it absolutely happened to me as well. The lesson here is that you as the family, you're the consumer, and you really need to be paying attention to how much value is being returned to you based on how much value you're shelling out to be a part of some of these organizations. All right, systemic issue number 3 is that playing tournaments in games have become way too much of the focus, way more than actually developing athletes. Now, for the sake of fairness here, I do think that some of the guilt does fall on the sport clubs here, but I do think that there are absolutely families, and I've spoken to them, that place way too much importance in how many games are being played each season, and also what specific tournaments their child's able to travel to. And the fact is that this importance on tournaments and games, especially in youth sport, has completely gotten out of hand. So let's set the record straight. Your child's ability to be successful has almost nothing to do with how many games they play or what tournaments they're able to travel to each year. They will only be successful in their sport if they develop as an athlete. This means learning the game, developing physically, honing their craft, and yes, even developing the mental side of their sport. Now, does competing and playing against other tough competition help athletes develop? Absolutely, but only to a certain point. Is it enough that we need to make our kids play a third to a half of the weekends a year and make sure that they travel to all the super select regional all-star power ranking tournaments? Absolutely not. I want every single parent that watches this to do me a favor. Go back and look at last year and add up all the money that you spent traveling to all of these tournaments. And I really want you to ask yourself a question. What if you took half, yes, only half of that amount that you spent on travel expenses and actually invested it in something that would develop your athlete a whole lot more. Maybe it's a few private lessons, maybe it's a skills camp, maybe it's even tickets to go watch a professional athlete play so that way they can see how that athlete prepares, plays, and carries themselves. Literally any of those things will be a much bigger return on your investment than traveling to some showcase tournament where there's 50 to 100 other teams, 1,000 other athletes, and on the off chance that somebody of influence in your sport actually sees your athlete, will it even matter if they haven't developed? But unfortunately, this is the current culture. Tournaments market themselves as this is the place to be seen. So sport clubs market to the families, hey, look at all these super awesome tournaments that we're going to. And unfortunately, so many families buy into this mindset and just end up lighting piles of money on fire. If you've gotten value so far from this video, then make sure to hit that subscribe button below and that notification bell so that way you never miss another video. All right, the fourth and final systemic issue that I'm going to talk about that stems from the fact that youth sport has ballooned to well in excess of $20 billion is that everybody thinks that they're a coach. Now, this could be people thinking that they're great sport coaches. This could be individuals with no formal training thinking that they're qualified to get strength and conditioning results from athletes. And yes, unfortunately, there are absolutely individuals out there with no formal training or experience working with young athletes' minds and calling themselves mental coaches. Now, let's be clear. I don't think that you should necessarily expect the same level of quality of training that professional and Olympic athletes receive, although at times that can be available. But you should absolutely have the expectation that whomever you choose to work with your athlete has the relevant training and experience, or at least some sort of proven track record to show you that they can get the results they're promising you. Unfortunately, the youth sport market has been guilty at times of allowing just about anybody to call themselves a coach or an expert without anybody asking the question, is this person even qualified or capable of adding value? For example, how many times do you see this from one of your local sport clubs? Hey, we got this new coach. They're a 3-time all-star, played at a high level, and wow, they played at that high level for a long, long time. Now, great for that person for being able to find success long-term in a sport. It's incredibly hard to do. But does that automatically qualify that person as someone who's going to be a great coach? Because the fact is, regardless of how good you were as an athlete, that has almost no correlation with your ability to be an effective coach. Now listen, I know coaches who were tremendous athletes, played at a high level, and yes, they went on to become great coaches. I also know coaches who never played at a high level, and they are some of the best coaches that I've ever seen. I also know great athletes who under no circumstances should be allowed to coach a young person because they either can't communicate, they don't have the patience, or they simply don't understand how to teach. I see similar issues that pop up in the strength and conditioning space, and I even see it in my own field. I can't tell you the number of times where I see a coach who's taken some weekend certification course or read a few books, and now they're calling themselves a mental training expert. I'll share a personal example from my own career. In my market out here in Denver, there is an individual who is conducting mental training services who is in no way, shape, or form qualified to do so. And yet, in the last 5 years, I've had 9 individuals come to work with me because this person couldn't get those athletes results. So let me pose this question to you. Do you think that a young person who goes to see a mental coach or someone calling themselves a sports psychologist, and that young person fails to get results or fails to overcome the problem that they sought out help for, do you think that young person says to themselves, oh, there must be something wrong with that mental coach? No. What that young person immediately thinks is that there must be something deeply wrong with me. And this is the central issue that happens far too often in youth sport. If a young person fails to get results or fails to produce because of a horrible coach or a bad strength and conditioning coach or even a bad mental coach, they don't immediately think that there's something wrong with that coach. Especially this generation of athlete that is already incredibly self-critical is only going to be more likely that they think that something is wrong with them. And this has some severe, potentially long-term risks towards the mental health of that athlete. Because here's the thing, not only do you as the consumer not like having one pulled over on you, but it also makes life that much harder for the people who actually do high quality work. Because those athletes that came to me after working with this person who has no business mentally training athletes, those athletes now have to work 2 or 3 times harder just to get themselves back to a good place. It only makes things that much harder for the great sport coaches, for the great strength and conditioning coaches, for the great mental coaches, because believe me, there's a lot of really good people doing some really incredible work out there. But there is also a lot of highly questionable individuals out there that simply refuse to put in the time and the energy to earn the privilege of working with your athlete. All right, so how do we begin to solve these issues? And it's really pretty simple. The consumer of this industry needs to recognize the power that they have. And the consumer, of course, is the individual family. Fact is, it's the parents that are cutting the checks that have the power, because regardless of what any individual club or any individual coach tells you, you're the one paying their bills. Because if you want to stop daddy ball, for example, in club sports, enough families need to step up and say, hey, isn't it a little ridiculous that we're paying all this money, still paying for our uniforms and our equipment, still paying for our travel, and all we're getting is an overcrowded team coached by a parent and training in an overcrowded facility? If you want to make sure clubs don't underdeliver, then you as the consumer need to be following up with your athlete and making sure that they're actually getting value from those strength and conditioning sessions or even the mental training work that's being offered to them. And you probably also really need to be looking into the people that you choose to provide any service for your athlete. Simple questions such as, are they qualified? Do they have any training in this area? What's their track record? Or is there anybody out there that will attest to their ability to provide this service? Simple questions like that will go such a long way in protecting both you and your checkbook, and most importantly, your athlete. Now, before you go today, I have a free gift for you for stopping by the channel. If you have an athlete who could really use a boost in their mental performance, I want you to go to trainwithperk.com/free guide. That guide contains 3 easy steps that any athlete can use to better mentally perform for their next big moment. Trainwithperk.com/free guide. It's free for a reason. Go get it. If you enjoyed the video, hit that thumbs up button. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe. And if you haven't already, get over there, trainwithperk.com, to get your copy of that 100% free guide. It's really going to help. I'll see you next week.